Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're just going to give everyone a minute or so to continue filtering in, and then we'll get going. Welcome also if you're joining on the replay. All right, let's get going. Thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to this webinar from Equileap focusing on gender equality in emerging markets. This is all focusing on Equileap's most recently released report, which assesses 1,500 companies in emerging markets. We're really excited to present this to you today since it's our inaugural report on this area of the world. Overall, today we're going to be going through Equileap and our mission. We'll also talk about our research methodology and how we gather the data. I'll take you through the findings of the report. And then we also have a special guest who is Timo Pfeiffer from Solactive. He's the Chief Markets Officer there. Solactive is a leading provider of indexing, benchmarking, and calculation solutions, the global investment and trading community. Equileap and Solactive have been partnering for quite a few years now on various indices, so we're really excited to be launching a new one on emerging markets. There will be time for questions, so please submit those in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure not to use the chat function since we won't be checking that one so much. And if you're watching on replay, feel free to submit any questions to our email, info@equileap.com. We'd really like to hear from you. Note that the session will be recorded as well, so you're very welcome to request it by email and to share it around colleagues. And without further ado, the speakers from Equileap's side today are Diana van Maasdijk, our CEO. We also have Heather Larson, our Associate Director of Research. My name is Natalia Hussain. I'm a Research Engagement Specialist. And we also have Fatima Abbas, who's a Research Analyst. So I'd like to hand over to Diana now, who's going to introduce everyone to Equileap and to our mission.
Thank you, Natalia, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Let me take a few minutes to just go over our background and who we are as Equileap. We are an ESG data provider that focuses on diversity and equality. Our focus is to close the equality gap in the workplace. And we think that we can do that if investors add a gender and diversity lens to their investments. So what we have is the largest and most comprehensive database on gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. We have been focusing namely on gender equality since 2016 when we launched, 2017 when we presented our first data set. But I'm also very proud that since last year, we have added also race and ethnicity and other LGBTQ indicators to our data set. Next screen, please. So what do we have in our data set? Our data set is composed of about 5,600 publicly listed companies around the world. We select these companies on their market cap, $2 billion or more, and on whether they are listed in some of the main indices in the more than 45 countries that we cover. We cover 21 indicators, which later will be presented on the data that we have collected this year. And we have 10 years of historical data. What this allows us to do is to really cover pretty much the largest amount of companies out there and indices. And since last year, we added 1,500 emerging markets indices. These are included in the 5,600. But this means that we are now covering both developed markets and emerging markets. And this we make this available to investors so that they can add an equality lens to all the products that they are creating. Next slide, please, Natalia. So why do we do this? What we have seen from much of the backtesting that has been done on our data and the indices research is that investing with a gender equality lens is not only good for society, for creating a more just society for everyone, but it's also good for your wallet. We have seen different research done, whether it's been outside of Equileap or within Equileap, that when you select the companies that have the better gender equality, you are also selecting the companies that are doing better on the stock market. In total, right now, we're very proud to see that there's more than 8 billion invested in products that use Equileap's data and indices, and this includes UBS, Amundi, HSBC, Morgan Stanley, and so forth. And they have also been telling us that it's an interesting way of selecting companies because it allows them to find those which have both financial outperformance and social outperformance. Here are a couple of the researchers that we have seen which produce a lower risk and higher financial impact, but I won't go through them because I think you can always look at the research yourself and look at it. The next slide. So finally, how is our data used? In the beginning, we were mostly using our data for indices, for index construction, and that's why I'm also very happy that this webinar, we will go through Solactive's new index using our data. But we also see that our data is being used for ESG integration, mostly because there is an increased interest in social data, and Equileap's data strengthens the S of ESG, but there's also portfolio analysis, shareholder engagement, and controversy screening. Next slide. Okay, so here's where I leave you with Heather, who will go over our research process, and then we will go into the data that we have collected. Heather, to you, please.
Great. Thanks, Diana. So in order to research 5,600 companies every year, we've developed a really comprehensive research process with lots of checks and balances. So every year we update our evaluation on every single company in our data set on all 21 indicators. So to do that, first of all, we do desk research. So our evaluations are based entirely on publicly available data published by the companies themselves. So first step is researchers gather that data. Then once we have the preliminary evaluation of a company, there's a peer review process, so really strict quality review. We have senior researchers looking at the data, researchers discussing amongst each other best decisions in gray areas. So there's a really qualitative look at these indicators and a very human look at these indicators. We don't use any AI or data scraping for this part of the process. Finally, once internally we're satisfied with the evaluation, we engage with the companies themselves. So every company gets their preliminary evaluation, and then they can give us feedback. So they can validate the data, they can propose new values, and this is a really good moment for companies to understand how they're being evaluated, for us to make sure we haven't missed anything in the public reporting, or that we haven't misinterpreted anything, or if they've published anything new since the time of research, we can also collect that. So over the years, we've seen a lot of companies engaging year on year, but also new companies coming in every year, which is really nice to see. And we start to see the companies that are engaging every year, we do start to see improvements both in transparency on the different metrics that we look at, as well as their performance. So that's great to see as well. So to evaluate these companies, we use the Equileap scorecard. There are actually 21 indicators that are available in our data set to clients, and 19 of those are scored. So that contributes to the score that you'll see for companies. So across the Equileap scorecard, we have 4 categories. First is gender balance in leadership in the workforce, and also gender of the CEO, CFO, and chair. So by gender balance, we're looking for 40 to 60% women in each of these categories. So board of directors, executive team, senior management, workforce. For category B, we're looking at equal compensation and work-life balance. We're looking at whether the company has a living wage commitment, whether they're transparent on the gender pay gap, have a strategy to close the gender pay gap, and those companies that are actually closing the gender pay gap, so a mix of transparency and performance. We look at parental leave options, so both published by the companies themselves and the statutory leave available in the countries where they operate. And finally, we look at flexible work options, so flexible work hours, flexible work locations available to all employees. For category C, we're looking at a number of policies that promote gender equality in the workplace, but also workplace that's safe and equal for everyone. There's 8 different policies here, but some that stand out are an anti-sexual harassment policy published by the company, as well as a supplier diversity policy, so a program to procure from women-owned businesses specifically. Finally, for category D, we look at a company's commitment, transparency, and accountability. So here we're looking for 2 really specific things. So commitment to women's empowerment, being a signatory to the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, as well as a gender audit, which is a really in-depth third-party screening of a company's gender equality practices and policies. In addition to these indicators on the scorecard, we also monitor for gender equality controversies and actually race and ethnicity controversies as well. So this could be class actions, individual cases, official rulings, dealing with gender-based violence and discrimination against a company. So we have that mix of what is a company publishing, what are their policies, how are they doing, versus how are they performing? Are there any controversies investors need to be aware of? So to do all this research, we have a couple teams working on it. So first of all, we have our core research team in the Netherlands. So there are 6 of us, and everyone has extensive experience as a research analyst, and also then their kind of respective niche on the team. So anywhere from research engagement, which is actually reaching out to the companies with our data validation process, also writing reports, so the findings that you can all read, as well as the more technical analysis and actually running the process of researching all 5,600 companies every year. Then we have a remote research team based in India. We've been working with this team for over 5 years, so we have a really close relationship with them. They do step 1 of the process, so the research gathering, and they work really closely with our core research team every week, so sending batches of data, that preliminary research, and then there's a very interactive feedback process every week when we do that peer review, so that the quality of data stays really high, and there's trainings both ways, and feedback both ways. So we work really closely with the team in India, and they do great work. So finally, I'm going to pass this over to Natalia and then Fatima to actually go into the findings of our latest emerging market report. So over to you, Natalia.
Thanks so much, Heather, for that introduction to Equileap. We're now going to delve into the actual emerging markets findings from our 2023 research. So just a note, these are the highlights from the report and the interesting standout moments. But if you would like to see more detail and more of an overview, you can see the full report on our website. So in terms of the scope of research, in 2023, we evaluated 1,494 companies. They were all publicly listed mid and large cap companies, and they span across 24 markets in the Americas, EMEA, and Asia Pacific. So in total, we worked out that this represents 43 million employees, so a huge, huge number. In terms of methodology, this is the same as what Heather described a moment ago, so focusing on publicly available information and always engaging with companies as well to give them a chance to add extra. So in terms of the key takeaways from our analysis, firstly, we found that there is a vast amount of data available on gender equality in emerging markets. This is really good news because sometimes there might be a misconception that this data is less available. We found that the rate of no data across all metrics that we evaluate was 70. So we had 73% data available compared to 81% data available in developed markets. So that's a really small difference between the 2 data sets, showing that this research is really worth doing. And the outcomes do give us a clear picture of how emerging market companies are actually doing. In terms of average score, we found that the emerging markets data set had 32% on Equileap's gender equality scorecard. Now, this is very low, unfortunately. It is much lower also than the developed markets average of 44%. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement across the board. We did find some encouraging bright spots on specific metrics, such as gender pay gap disclosures and sexual harassment policies or anti-sexual harassment policies, which we'll go into a bit more later. And then in terms of top performing companies, we found that there are some companies that are really putting in very clear efforts to sort out gender inequality, and they show the potential to lead the way and act as examples to the other companies that might not be doing quite so well. Okay, first we're going to take a look at some aggregate findings, looking at top countries and companies across the data set. So this heat map here shows you how the largest markets are doing on Equileap's gender equality scorecard. On the left, you've got the countries in order of performance from highest to lowest performance. And just a note here that we did cut off the representation at 30 plus companies. So that means that every country that you're seeing here has at least 30 companies in the data set. That's to make sure that the aggregates are informative. But the overall data set does include many more countries. You'll also want to note that the number of companies per country varies. So for example, in South Africa, we had 34, whereas in China, we had 580. That's worth bearing in mind when you're looking at comparisons. But if we now jump our eyes over to the right, that's where you see the average scores of each country. So if we look at the top there, you'll see that South Africa is doing the best overall in terms of gender equality, so scoring 50% on average. And then right down at the bottom, we see that China is just scoring 24% average. So companies really need to step up to the mark there. If we look along the top, that's where we see Equileap's indicators. So we've got the 19 scored indicators that Heather was mentioning earlier, ranging all the way from category A to category D. And the colors represent how well that market is doing on average. So green means that they're performing well, red means they're not performing well. So if we draw our eyes over to the green areas, this is mostly focused on the policies. For example, having a good training and career development policy, most companies have that. Human rights commitments or safety at work commitments are also doing really well. However, if we then draw our eyes over to the red areas, there are some clear issues when it comes to committing to paying employees living wages, gender pay gap disclosures, and supplier diversity policies. In terms of the mixed colors, this is more towards the left-hand side of the heat map. This is interesting because it shows that there's quite a lot of variety in the representation of women at different levels of the workforce across the countries that we analysed. So that's something that we'll go into a bit more in a moment. Now let's take a look at the companies that did really well on our scorecard. So this is the top 10 from our 2024 Emerging Markets report. The top company was TSKB, which is a Turkish bank, and they had a gender equality score of 71%. Then the second company was Nestle Malaysia. This is the Malaysian subsidiary of Nestle. And then the third company was Oneness Biotech, based in Taiwan. They're a pharmaceuticals company. A couple of interesting things to note here. The first one is that the gender equality scores are really high compared to that emerging markets average of 32%. So it does show that there are companies leading the way and really putting in a lot of effort. Something else that's interesting to note is the sector. So if you take a look there, we've got a huge variety ranging from financials to healthcare to materials. And this is a useful thing to remember, that it does dispel that myth that some sectors are always going to struggle when it comes to gender equality, and that maybe other sectors are predestined to find it easier to close various gaps. So as a general takeaway, please remember that we can hold companies accountable to improving their gender equality performance, and clearly it can be done across many sectors. Okay, now delving into that really interesting and important topic of gender balance. This one is obviously a big topic of interest when we're evaluating gender equality. Looking first at the overall picture at all country or all company levels. So Equileap, as we mentioned earlier, evaluates multiple levels of the workforce. We look at the overall workforce, then senior management, the executive team, and the board. And we've also added in the CEO measures here for interest. So on the left, we're seeing the emerging markets chart, and on the right, we're seeing the developed markets chart. Interesting thing to note, firstly, is that the emerging markets numbers for women's representation are much lower than the developed markets numbers. So for example, if we look at the workforce, we've got 38% in developed markets and just 32% in emerging markets. And then if we look at the executives, that's only 14% women's representation in executive teams in emerging markets. So we do have a problem there of women's representation being lower across the board. However, you will also notice that the pattern is identical across the two charts. So this shows that there are global problems in the drop-off of women's representation, where it starts off relatively, well, let's not say high because it's still very much below 50%, but it starts off doing well at the workforce level. And then we have a very sharp drop off in the internal management levels, especially. The board tends to be a little bit higher, perhaps because there is, it's easier to bring in people from the outside than to promote people internally. And then finally, if you look at the CEO numbers at the top there, what's interesting is that both of these numbers are very similar. So we've got 6% in emerging markets and 7% in developed markets. This is also showing a global problem in terms of getting women to those very high levels. Equileap also gathers data on whether companies publish a gender category other than men and women. So with this one, we're looking at disclosure. So it's not so much focusing on looking for a particular number, but we're looking at whether companies are offering an extra option for their employees to acknowledge and recognize gender diversity in their workforces. So in emerging markets, we found that 1.6% of companies recorded this kind of extra data, and that's compared to 12% in developed markets. So there is a big difference there. Focusing on something more positive, we found that 3 companies have reached gender balance at all corporate levels. So this covers the board, executive, managers, and workforce. And we define that as reaching the 40 to 60% range. So 40 to 60% men and women in every single team to allow for a bit of variation. So those companies are Oneness Biotech in Taiwan, Mega Holding, another Taiwanese company, and Blue Moon Group in Hong Kong. We've also taken a look at women in top positions, such as the chair of the board, the CEO, and CFO. And in terms of the best performers here, we found that South Africa did really well on chair of the board. They have 21% women in chair positions, compared to 6% on average across all emerging markets. And then Thailand wins on both of the CEO and CFO metrics. So in Thailand, 17% of CEOs are women, compared to a 6% average, and 51% of CFOs are women, compared to an 18% average across emerging markets. So that's a really standout performance there from Thailand. Okay, I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Fatima, who's going to continue taking you through our findings, starting with the gender pay gap.
Thank you, Natalia, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. Let's carry on with our findings. So looking at the gender pay gap, broadly, the gender pay gap means comparing the average salaries of women with the average salaries of men. Now, when we look at the gender pay gap for companies, we come across many different kinds of disclosure, ranging from adjusted figures that are based on equal pay for equal work, to unadjusted mean and median figures that are based on averages and midpoint values. Before I go on to our findings, I would like to stress the fact that gender pay gaps are an essential tool for companies to examine their pay inequalities at a structural and individual level. So we really recommend that companies commit to publishing their gender pay gap and addressing it. In terms of the gender pay gap, at Equileap, we look at different facets of the pay gap. So for instance, we look at whether a company publishes an overall pay gap. We also look at whether a company publishes pay gaps at 3 or more corporate levels, covering all of their employees. And then we also look at whether a company has published 2 or more strategies specifically directed towards closing the pay gap. Now, when it comes to disclosing any kind of gender disaggregated pay data, we see that in the emerging markets, 38% of companies have published any kind of pay gap data, compared to the developed markets where the figure stands at 33%. So in terms of transparency, it's interesting to see that emerging markets are actually doing better in terms of disclosing pay gap data. Now here you can see a country-level breakdown of the companies that are publishing their pay gap data. Again, as a reminder, these findings are based on countries with 30 or more companies in our data set. Now, overall, you can see that there is a lot of variety here and big disparities between the left and right sides. I would like to mention that here we can see that 5 countries have a publication rate of over 50%, which is quite encouraging to see. Now, moving on to the left, we see that South Korea is leading the way with 88% of companies publishing their gender pay gap. This is followed by Taiwan at 76%, Brazil at 67%, and India at 65%. We did notice that countries that have a higher pay gap disclosure rate often have to do with the fact that there is legislation in place that requires companies to publish their pay gap. This holds true for countries like South Korea, Brazil, and India. Now, if we turn towards the right side, we see that China is at the lowest rate of disclosure at 5%, even though it has the largest representation of companies in our data set. This is followed by Indonesia at 18% and Turkey at 20%. Now, talking about closing the gender pay gap. At Equileap, what this means is that a company has a pay gap of 3% or less in favor of any gender, and this has to be an unadjusted mean figure. Now, this is the golden standard we want companies to achieve because it shows us that a company has addressed and fixed pay inequalities at a structural level. If we look at the findings, we see that 0.9% of companies in the emerging markets have closed their pay gap. This is slightly lower, but similar to our findings in developed markets, where 1.1% of companies have closed the pay gap. Now, if we look at the 0.9% in emerging markets, that actually represents 14 companies from different countries. So we have 3 companies from Turkey, 3 from Taiwan, 2 from Brazil, 1 from South Korea, Thailand, Hong Kong, India, Qatar, Chile, and Mexico. What this shows us is that it is certainly challenging to close the gender pay gap, but it is definitely possible around the world. Now I'm going to talk about our indicator that focuses on combating sexual harassment. It is one of our key indicators, and having a clear and accessible anti-sexual harassment policy shows to employees and the general wider public that a company not only has awareness of the issue, but has a mechanism in place to protect its employees. In the emerging markets, we saw that 54% of companies have published an anti-sexual harassment policy. It's quite encouraging to see that over half of the companies researched in the emerging markets do have a policy in place. Compared to the developed markets, where the global average was 65%, this is slightly lower, but we can see that they are above average, and we have seen that in the previous years, these percentages have been increasing. So we're hopeful that year on year, they'll continue to increase, and more companies will publish an anti-sexual harassment policy. Here we can see a country-level breakdown of the companies publishing this policy. Overall, we see that 7 countries have a publication rate of 80% or more. India is leading the way with 100% publication rate, and this is followed by Brazil, Taiwan, and Malaysia, all of whom crossed the 90% mark. It's quite encouraging to see that the overall rate of disclosure is quite high compared to the developed markets, where Spain was the highest performing company and the only company to cross the 90% mark. So in terms of transparency, here we again see that developed markets, the emerging markets are doing better than the developed markets. Now I'm going to talk about the supply chain and the company's supply chains. And it's important to focus not only on gender equality within companies themselves, but to also look at gender equality and diversity within company supply chains. You may be surprised to know, but according to the ILO, there are 190 million women working in the global supply chain. This is exactly why we need to pay closer attention to what kind of policies are in place that companies have in place for their suppliers. Here you can see that we have 4 indicators that cover company supply chains. And if I start from the left, we'll see that 56% of companies have a social supply chain compared to 80% in the developed markets. Now, what a social supply chain means is that we have basically 56% companies in the emerging markets that require their suppliers to expressly prohibit child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, or any such human rights violations. With this indicator, we do see that the disparity in comparison to the developed markets is quite high, but it is encouraging to see that even in the emerging markets, the global average is above 50%. Next, we see that 30% of companies in emerging markets require their suppliers to prohibit sexual harassment. This remains a work in progress, even in the developed markets where the global average is 40%. However, Brazil sets an exemplary standard in emerging markets with 75% of companies requiring their suppliers to publish an anti-sexual harassment policy. Next, we're going to talk about the indicator that looks at whether or not companies require their suppliers to commit to paying their workers a living wage. Here, we would like to see, this is an area that we want to see a huge improvement in because only 3% of companies require their suppliers to commit to paying living wages. However, this is not only specifically a supply chain problem, it is a wider problem because only 6% of companies in the emerging market themselves pay their employees a living wage. And even the statistic in the developed markets here is quite low and stands at 11%. Lastly, we're going to look at whether companies procure their goods and services from women-owned businesses. So here we see that in the emerging markets, less than 3% of companies procure from women suppliers. Again, in terms of supplier diversity, when it comes to gender, this is an area we want companies and their suppliers to definitely invest in more. Overall, if we look at these findings, we see a trend in the developed and emerging markets, where when we look at indicators like the social supply chain, companies are doing fairly better and asking more, there's more of an active commitment from their suppliers. However, as soon as we move on to indicators that have specifically to do with gender, we see that companies and suppliers need to put in a lot more effort. This brings us to the end of our findings.
Thank you so much, Fatima. I'm now very happy to hand over to Timo from Solactive. Now that we've had an overview of the trends that we're seeing in emerging markets, we're going to look at how this data can be used in practice. So Timo is going to explain to us how this new innovative index that Solactive made with Equileap can offer the opportunity to create financial products related to socially responsible investing. Over to you.
Hello, hi, and good morning to everyone. Natalia, thank you very much for having me today. We've already looked and heard about a lot of numbers, and now on the index side, I need to add even more numbers. So before we actually go there and talk about the index that we have created on back of the Equileap gender data, I want to add a few, 2-3 sentences on Solactive, who we are, what we do for those of you that probably don't know that yet. So effectively, we do indices. Do means develop, calculate, run indices. It's about 30,000 currently right now as we speak that we have on our platform and that we actually do calculate. About 600, more than 600, I think the current count is something like 640 of those indices are being used in ETFs. And I'm proud and happily mentioning this. And we talk a lot about ETFs because any ETF that you find in the public domain, in the public space with a ticker, with an ISIN code, you can actually see who's doing the index, and you can actually see also a way for us to calculate the assets. Out of those indices, we have done close to 10, I believe, together with Equileap data on the developed market side with the existing set of data. And mentioning this also in the ETF context, I think, Diana, you mentioned it at the beginning, that a few of those are used in ETF format by clients of ours and Equileap. Want to mention the largest one with more than $1 billion in assets, focusing on developed markets, is issued by UBS here in Europe and available. What we always like in doing indices are what I would label unique data points. Something we can slice and dice, something we can sort and rank, something we can use as a basis for construction of indices. And while we do indices since 2007, so Solactive as a company has started about 16 years ago, 2007, we are engaging with Equileap, with Diana and the team since 2017. I remember this because this is also the year that I have joined Solactive, not that this is linked in any way, but this is when we have launched together Solactive and Equileap, the very first index. So we have always liked the gender data points back in the days, 2017, also being very unique, very new. But Equileap have always gone, let me say, deeper. Heather described it earlier with the matrix and the signals indicators you're using. So deeper in terms of analyzing the data point. And of course, it's a logic extension. And we're very happy that now Equileap are also going broader. So beyond developed markets into emerging markets. And then we've done and engaged and done, let me say, the obvious thing, a very interesting thing, which is launching a respective emerging market index. How we've done that, how that actually looks, you will see the details. Let me run you through this on the next slide. So at the very top, you see something starting universe. So that's effectively a benchmark index from Solactive called GBS, Global Benchmark Series, that comprises 22 emerging market countries and is effectively our emerging market benchmark. So there's no filtering based on gender. There's no filtering on anything else other than being representative in the respective country and covering 85% of the market cap in the different countries. As a first screen and filter, what we're actually doing is not yet gender specific, but generic ESG filtering, basically filtering for controversies, filtering for activities, for example, controversial weapons, business activities with a very large companies being active, very large in fossil fuel activities, tobacco, alcohol, etc., are being screened out based on generic ESG screenings. And what you have called Equileap alarm bells. So again, we're talking about controversies, we're talking about violations, we're talking about court rulings against the respective companies, which are indicators or signals to be excluded in the first step of the screening. The second step is really the core part of this index to basically look across all different sectors individually, which companies are the top 50% based on what you have described earlier, the Equileap gender score. So within each sector, we look at the top half performing companies and keep those and construct based on those the index. The index ultimately, you see this as a next step here, is actually market cap weighted, i.e. we weight based on the size of the company, subject to a 10% cap per individual company in the index. Now this is the point where I want to add a few numbers, starting from a starting universe of more than 1,500 companies. So at the top of this list, we're talking about more than the 1,500 that we had mentioned earlier, and then are filtering down step by step. And really by different and any of those individual steps, companies get excluded or selected, so that ultimately at the bottom in the Solactive Equileap Emerging Market Index, Gender Index, we are remaining with just north of 600 companies. Something we had taken a closer look at, trying to some extent confirming the obvious, but also trying to make sense of the scores and of the gender data and some of the gaps or let's say developments that are still happening in the respective companies, but also on probably more societal level in the respective countries, actually translate into the composition and into the index. So for example, we've looked at, I've mentioned about the sector screening, we've looked at it on a sector level, where really two sectors that basically drop down in the weight of the index, of the emerging market Solactive Equileap Index versus our starting universe, are energy and finance. Probably not surprising, but those have less of a weight in our Solactive Equileap Gender Index compared to the respective starting universe. On a country level, and it's been shown in some of the examples you had mentioned earlier, two of the biggest beneficiaries, i.e. higher weight in the gender index compared to the starting universe, are South Korea and Taiwan, at the expense of, that means the largest underweights of China, India, and Saudi Arabia. Not surprising, as I've said, and probably a signal of additional weight to go on the one hand side in terms of closing the gender gap, but on the other hand, also reflecting and translating into performance of those companies, areas, sectors that have still a way to go. And if they progress, should also be reflected in the respective performance. That's the whole idea of the share prices. Now, looking at performance, if we go to the next slide, what's actually the outcome? What's the result? So we got the Equileap gender data, emerging market gender data back till 2019. So this is the start date of the index. And you will see the lighter blue line, which is the Solactive Equileap Emerging Markets Gender Index versus the starting universe, our benchmark emerging market index being the thicker blue line. So you will actually easily see in the first glance that there is very strong outperformance in the gender strategy versus the wider emerging markets benchmark over those years since beginning of 2019. If you look down at the table, you will see about 2.5% annualized return of the benchmark index versus about 6.5%, so about 4% points, close to 4% per annum, stronger performance of the respective gender index. The volatility, so risk measure, the line you see below, is slightly higher, but only slightly higher for the gender index, still resulting in about more than 2 times higher Sharpe ratio, so risk-adjusted return, risk-adjusted profile of the gender index. So there is already, based on those companies in the index, based on those companies having made progress or scoring strong on the gender ratio and rating, a very strong performance reflected in what you see, the light blue line, so the emerging markets gender index. And with what we've seen earlier, still way to go. Of course, the whole idea is with more capital allocation into those companies that are scoring high and an increasing companies scoring stronger going forward to also reflect in a continued strong performance. We have started this one index. I'd like to mention that we do a lot of customization, a lot of adjustment of indices as starting points, like we have done in the developed market space. So any variation of that index, for example, slicing and dicing, selecting by a certain set of countries or having a stronger zoom. For example, in the developed market space, we have a top 100 gender index, would be possible, and discussions we are having to do something similar in the emerging market space. But this is, let's say, the flagship index, the main and a larger main index developed based on the Equileap emerging markets data. We're very happy to do that with, I've said since 2017, the cooperation and the data as we know it in place already. I'm excited to widen and broadening this now to emerging markets. And this is really just a start for us, and happy to continue the projects and the cooperation with Equileap and the whole team there, of course, and together with our clients. So I'll loop off here. A lot of numbers that I have shared here. Any questions we can probably leave to the Q&A, or Natalia has explained earlier how to reach out and how to connect for the recording of the webinar.
Great. Sorry, losing my voice. Great. Thanks so much, Timo. That was really insightful. And just ending on a little quote here that investing in women is not just the right thing to do, it's also the financially smart thing to do, as we've just seen. So we've now got some time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so. If there's anything that's been brewing in your mind while you've been listening, please feel free to add them into the Q&A box at the bottom. Anything related to our research methodology, our findings, but also we're very happy to answer questions about the index and about the potential of using data for various other decisions. So I'll hand over to Heather, who's going to take us through the questions that have been coming in.
So far, it's been quiet, so please feel free to ask anything. We have about 15 minutes that we can use to answer anyone's questions.
Maybe to get us going, I know something that often comes to people's minds when they're seeing those big heat maps about performance and the areas that companies are not doing so well. Heather, do you have any insights on what companies can do to actually improve their scores on the gender equality scorecard?
Yeah, so step one is publishing. So transparency is key. Our evaluations are based entirely on publicly available data, so it has to be in the public realm and it has to be up to date, so published within the past 2 years. So that's usually the advice to companies. Step one is low-hanging fruit. Make sure that the policies that they already do have are out in the open. But then in terms of performance, that's a longer term strategy. That's something that takes more work, more strategy, and I think essentially really buy-in from top management. So looking at the CEO, the executive team, senior managers, everybody needs to be on board. It can't just be one D&I team working on this project by themselves. It's really something that needs to be ingrained in the whole company. So whether it's setting targets, developing policies that like great parental leave policies, flexible work, really making sure that the company culture supports gender equality and that there's buy-in from everyone. We do have one question coming in so far. So how can a company get access to these data and compare with the competition? So that's a great question. Thank you, Vikram. We do have company engagement is super important. Companies can always reach out directly to research@equileap.com or any of the contact information you find for Equileap. So one, they can reach out for their own scores, but then also for benchmark reports. It's a product that we offer. So companies can choose five other companies that they want to benchmark themselves against and get really detailed insight to how their peers are doing, as well as more in-depth country analysis, sector analysis. So really a deep dive into basically their peers, their competition. And it's a great way for companies to really leverage the insights of our data set within their company. So it's putting on the agenda essentially how they're doing compared to their peers, where they're doing well, where their peers might be outperforming, what are best practices for other companies in their industry or in their country or realm. So we're really happy to talk to companies about benchmark reports if they're interested in that. So thank you. Any other questions at the moment?
Maybe a question for Solactive, for Timo. I was wondering if you can give us an example or let us know what are the different type of products that can be built with indices. For those people who know indices very well, I think this would be an older question, but what are the type of products and how, so that companies can know that there is a way to focus on their impact if they're able to join the index or not. Maybe a little bit of an example of the different type of products and how this index also can be adjusted for different products.
Thanks, Diana. Yes, sure. We are enabling, at the end of the day, some financial products that in different shapes and forms can be issued and ultimately are a tool for capital allocation into the respective constituents of the index, underlyings of the product, so companies, stocks ultimately. I have mentioned ETFs as the obvious and public example, and I've said obvious, probably best known example, because everyone on this call, you and me, everyone as private investors can access those. In a similar sense, we are doing a lot of indices that are being used in structured products. So that's notes, that's certificates issued by banks and being made available for investment, again, for institutional or private investors. So this is a way to be more flexible. And for example, just look at, I'm making this up now, a basket of the top 10 gender companies per country. Yeah, a more selective, more targeted, closer set of underlyings based on this data. The ESG data in general, and if I like to call this gender data as the S in ESG, increasingly popular and being asked for in the institutional space, pension funds, asset owners, trying to first place, understand and analyze their current and existing investments by different matrices. Climate data is an obvious one and one that is probably most frequently discussed and being implemented or analyzed. And as I said, the S in ESG, gender data, and how do we score today, and what potentially needs to be adjusted in the portfolio of such asset owner pension fund is another example. And as a next step, of course, after such an analysis, in order to tilt the portfolio, so the investments in a certain way, more positively towards a gender impact, of course, we can construct, and it's something we're doing, custom tailored indices, allowing for exactly that, ultimately capital allocation in a specific way based on here the gender direction or closing the gender gap. Those are examples that we basically do on a daily basis with different products being used behind it.
Thank you.
So we have another question, a bit about the research universe. So are there any plans to add more companies in the coming years to emerging markets, and how can a company apply to participate? So the way that we define our research universe is actually set. So companies don't need to apply. We'll always research our entire research universe every year. And the way that it's defined at the moment is for companies with a market capitalization of USD 2 billion or greater. So that's mid and large cap companies. There is potential to expand to small caps. At the moment for developed markets, we also only do mid and large cap companies. So there's a potential to move to small caps in the future, but at the moment for emerging markets, our data set does cover all mid and large cap companies.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, it was mentioned earlier by Timo, this is 85% of the free-floating market in emerging markets. So we are covering 85% of the emerging markets. The plan is for us to go and reach at some point all publicly listed companies. So that will be expanded in the future, and we hope to do that in the next few years. And here again, reiterating that you don't have to apply to be researched by Equileap. If you are a mid or large cap company, you will be researched every year.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think it looks like we've covered all the questions. Natalia, to you.
Yes, okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone. If any more questions come to mind, you're of course welcome to email us, as mentioned earlier. Thank you so much for attending our talk today. In terms of further resources, you can read the report on our website. You can reach out to Equileap at info@equileap.com for a trial of the data, or to ask about ordering a benchmark report for your company if you're a company representative. You're also very welcome to reach out to Solactive about anything index related and in terms of creating customized versions of those. So I hope you continue to have a really good day, and we'll end the session here. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.